Thanks very much, Benjamin, and thanks to everybody who's here tonight. I mean, first of all, I just want to say it was a real pleasure to be on the app, and because the poems were so beautifully presented, and there's something about getting one poem a day, and a number of people who've read my collections, even when they, because I'd share them then on Twitter or on Facebook, and people commented on the poems because it's different when you just see one on its own, and when you see it, even if you have read it years ago, just to see it afresh. So and also I suppose I like all the other parts of the app where people can do recordings and leave comments and then link to other poems and all that. I just think it's amazing what you're doing, and so thank you very much. That was just lovely for me. Um, I suppose I thought what I'd talk about first is a bit about how I got into writing. I grew up on a farm in County Roscommon, which is sort of the West Midlands in Ireland, and I always wanted to write. I had the dream of writing, like an awful lot of Irish people, but I didn't feel at all creative. Now, I studied English and philosophy in college, so I was obviously very interested in the arts, but I didn't have any confidence in my own ability to write at all, actually. And but when I was in my early 40s, there was this kind of, that desire to write came alive again for me. And I just started doing a night class. I followed the desire. I said, okay, look, I'll try it. I'll try it. What can I lose, at this point? And I I did a night class because I thought, first of all, I was interested in short stories. Um, but then I did a distance learning class, an introduction to creative writing. And in I think the second exercise, we were asked to write 4 poems. And that was the homework. And I wrote those 4 poems, and that was it. It really was like falling in love. And I was so surprised. And when I think about it, I love how, Robert Frost said, poems should surprise. Well, those poems surprised me, and poetry has continued to surprise me. It surprised me what I found myself writing about. I didn't think I'd go back and write about this farm that I'd left when I was 17. I mean, I was my early 40s, and I had left there when I was 17. I didn't expect to go back and to mine those memories. But there was, I think distance hones your memory, and poetry hones your memory. And the more I wrote, the more I was remembering. And so anyway, so that's how it got started for me. And I actually wanted to read one of the very first poems I wrote, if that's okay. And it's in this collection, The River, my first collection. And this poem actually started as a piece of prose, again, as an exercise on this course. And it was then when I started writing poetry, I made it into a poem. And it was the first poem I won a prize with in Listowel Writing Festival. And also it's about my grandmother, who I've written about quite a bit, and wrote the most recent poem I've written is about her again, which is just, again, the surprises that poetry gives you. But so I'll just read that, being as it's my very first poem, one of my first poems. Daily Bread. A white mist rises as she sifts a pound of flour into the worn tin basin, wide as Loch Carib. Blue veins lie like rivers on the map of her hands. She measures 1 teaspoon of bread soda, 2 teaspoons of salt. The plait at the nape of her neck, a fisherman's rope coiled at the quay. She scoops a hollow, pours a pint of buttermilk, splashing and spluttering into the well. With the rhythm of a roar, she kneads rough dough on the flour-dusted table, pushing it away, pulling it back, pushing it away again. With her wrist, she flicks a lock, silver grey frost in December, from her high cheekbones. Readying the bread for its hot harbour, she cuts a deep cross. Um, thank you. So that was one of the very first poems, and I suppose just to say then that poem winning a prize was all part of those early years. So I think my first poem was when I was 44. And then 10 years later, when I was 54, my first collection was published by Bloodaxe Books, that's The River. And so the first collection took a long time, probably 8 years in the making. And then the second collection took 4 years. So, it was different, but I'm glad I took that time. And that's one of the things I'd say to anybody writing poetry is take your time. I got really good advice along the way about that. And I suppose the first collection, I just built up the poems one by one, slowly over the time. And I didn't know how they would all connect at all. And it was only when I started to put the collection together, when I started to hope that I might find a publisher, that I started seeing the connections. And even, for example, there was a poem I'd written about my grandmother that I didn't realize was about her until I put it beside another poem that was about her. And I thought, oh yeah, that was about her as well. So I think that the putting together of a collection is a bit like the writing of a single poem. It's that intricate, it's that demanding. It needs, that kind of attention and care. And it can be as surprising as the writing one poem, what you find when you start to put 50 poems together. And maybe just I'd say one other thing, that in those years, those 10 years, I did a master's in writing in Wales, in the University of South Wales. And there, Jane Clarke, who was the Welsh poet laureate at the time, no relation, but she was my tutor. So for 2 years, I was going back and forth to Wales about every 6 to 8 weeks with a bunch of 6 poems for her to look at each time. And I would say that was such a gift to me to have. Gillian's a very lyrical, beautiful, thoughtful, inspiring poet. She's in her mid-80s and is as energetic as ever. And if I had to say one person that has made such a difference to my work, if I had to choose one, I think it would be Jane Clarke. So again, maybe to say to others, if you get a good tutor along the way, it can make all the difference, and it did to me. So maybe that's it for now. I mean, Benjamin, if you wanted to ask me any questions, or then I have listed out the poems that you put up this week, so I could read them, but I'll wait and see if you have anything to ask me about after that little introduction, I mean, it's a really good question. I'll tell you what I think it is, but it's interesting. I don't know whether this is right or not, but my impression is when I was in my 30s, I trained as a psychoanalyst. So it was a long training, 7 years training. And I believe that unlocked my creativity. Because the psychoanalytic, it goes into it's the internal world. I mean, it's funny because then when I started writing poetry, it was about looking out, but I think poetry is about bringing the internal and the external together. And so I think that long journey into the internal world as a psychotherapist and as on the training for psychoanalysis, I think that liberated lots within me. So if I had to, I think that's the change. And while I was, studying psychoanalysis, I had a supervisor who was really interested. He was Irish from Mayo, even though he was living in London, and he was really interested in literature. And he was always linking our learning as in psychoanalysis with literature. And I think I began to make those connections. And then I started reading poetry, and more in a different way. It wasn't in the way I did it in college. It wasn't about studying poetry. It was turning to poetry to help me with what I was going through emotionally. And that's a very different way to approach it. So I wasn't going to it primarily intellectually. I was going to it as a way of learning, understanding and solace and identifying with someone else, with what they were going through, and it's funny because some of the books I read at that time, I've got this book with me, the Bloodaxe anthologies. Well, I read, the very first one, the Staying Alive one, I think is the first one. And that was hugely important because of what I found there, the range of poems and poets I found there. So anyway, so that's go back when you said, what is it that made a difference? That's what I would say made the big difference for me. I mean, I've always felt that that poetry requires you to be able to feel intensely and to be able to bear your feelings, to bear what poetry brings up, as in to let yourself feel things. But I also think there's a restraint. Poetry isn't about a catharsis or an expression of everything, because you're making an object. You're making, so there's a lot of holding back as well. And I think it's about that combination of a depth of feeling and a depth of observation, and then yet holding back enough so that you make something that can be meaningful to others. So that's all the shaping that you do. And I guess that's the craft of poetry, is how you shape it so that others can get something from it, can be touched by it, or Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I think, again, it's for me, it's not an intellectual thing. It isn't that I say, oh, I want to communicate about my grandmother making bread. It's that somehow I got the image of her making bread in the kitchen and the sounds and the smells. And I wanted to, it's like, I think it's maybe more like a painter. You want to paint something that's in your mind and that's in your heart. And so I go where the tug on my heart is, if you see what I mean, or the image in my mind, or the music of a line. And I go where that brings me, and then I shape the poem out of that. But it isn't that I'm saying I want to tell other people about my grandmother. It isn't that. What I want to do every time, still, hopefully maybe sometime this week or next week, what I want to do is make a poem. That's what I want to do. And then but you said, do you want to share it? And then I want to share it when it's ready, when I feel it's ready to share. It's really important to me to get to readers and to get to an audience. I think that's hugely important, but not till and it's not that I want everybody to know about my grandmother. No, I want people to hear this poem. Do you see what I mean? There is a difference. That my memory of an experience with my grandmother helped me write this poem. So it's the poem I want to share. And so, it's not that I wanted to write a memoir. It's not that I wanted to write my autobiography. I'm not interested in that. That's not what I want to do. I want to write poems. Along the way, it shows aspects of my life, but that's not what's primary for me. It's something I feel quite strongly about, that sometimes people want to read the artist's life into the work, Whereas what I want them to do is read their lives into the work, find themselves in the work. That to me is much more interesting. The suck. Sometimes together, most often alone, we'd slip the catch on the rusted chain, follow the cart track through the bottoms. The river held our stories. It was where we'd go to talk or cry or be quiet in the company of the current. Whether it flowed fast after a flood, rolled in circling eddies, or drifted smooth and slow past stands of alder and silver green willow. We could look as far as the next bend or out to the island, speckled with yellow iris, bordered with sedge. We could dream of leaving, making lives of our own. Ask the river to bless us. Let us go. Well, I mean, first of all, it's just lovely to hear that you saw something in your mind. That's what's really important to me. Both the scene and then the hearing. What is it in the music of those lines? Where does that send you? You know, because again, I think poetry is so like music. I think it's because I think one of the problems with poetry is it's taught and looked on in the same place as the novel or the short story. But I think it's actually it should be in the music departments of universities. I think it's nearer to there, and so the music is so important, and I think it's both the music and the imagery that I hope touches people and brings them wherever. So I mean, I've no need for people. I wherever it brings people, I'm happy with that. You know, I've no kind of expectation. I mean, maybe I could just say though that this poem was inspired by a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. So she has this wonderful poem, The Moose, which I'm sure you know. And the first lines are from narrow provinces of fish and bread and tea. And of course, the province I grew up in, Connacht, is like a narrow province, not of fish, but of bread and tea. And there's something about it. So that was her journey away from the home place. So when I was reading that poem, I was thinking, because I did my thesis on Elizabeth Bishop, and so I was studying her very intensely. And when I was reading her poem, I was thinking, what was my journey away? What was the journey? And then I just remembered the catch on the gate and the going down to the river. And so it was her poem that led me to try and write my journey, yeah. Yeah, it's funny actually, because it's not that a particular piece would evoke, a piece of music would start a poem for me. It's more, when I'm crafting the lines, I'm saying them over and over again to hear the music, and I finish the line where the music tells me, and I make it, the stanzas are by the music of it. So it's more that I'm trying to create a music with the lines, rather than that I could say, I mean, sometimes I wrote a poem. There's a poem in this called The Blue Bible, and at the end, uh, the days when hope like a restless heifer goes astray, that is inspired by a line in Handel, all we like sheep have gone or gone astray, so and I was at the Messiah on Easter, and I was listening to that, and I went home and wrote that poem. So you're right, sometimes it does come directly from music, but it doesn't necessarily, I mean, I do love the Baroque, Bach and Handel, and Purcell and all those that music is very evocative for me, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a lot more intuitive. I would think though that all the reading of Hopkins and all the reading of, of poets, you get, I think you get a rhythm in your, on the mind. You pick up rhythm from the people that you're reading, and particularly iambic pentameter, that does come very naturally to us, as English speakers. But um, it is more intuitive, and it's trying to think. So say when the tree falls into the river, one of the poems that you featured this week, I'd be thinking of, you know, of what the tree did in the river, because I see that tree in front of, it's a real tree, a real river. And so the rhythm would be trying to reflect what it is the, the poem is expressing. That's what I'd be trying to do. Well, will I read Cypress? I think a lot of people like that on the app. I felt there was a very good response to it, so I'll read that. And this is inspired by the last. My father was dying. He was at home in his own house where he had lived all his life, and we were nursing him. And this comes from one of those nights going into the morning, a few weeks before he died. Cypress. Falling in and out of sleep all night, he suddenly struggles to sit up. Will you open the curtains so we'll see the dawn when it comes? He gazes out at the cypress that in his lifetime grew higher than the house. A tree that survived every winter's wind, its trunk ridged as a raised bed ready for seed, feathered foliage set to sprout flower balls, exposed roots worn bare as bones, branches touching the ground, forming a haven, a tree to sit in, quiet, waiting. Okay, well, I mean, just to say, in terms of inspirations, I'd have to say Seamus Heaney, and I think Seamus Heaney, obviously, his work. I mean, I could read his work forever, and I still have so much to read of his work and so much to learn from his work. That's definitely. But he was also an inspiration as a person, how he was as a poet in the world, and his generosity and his integrity. So I found him inspiring in that way as well. And also just his thoughtfulness and his reflectiveness, and all his essays about writing. All of that is, there's just so much more I could, I mean, I also want to say Patrick Kavanagh. He was an Irish poet who we had in school. And because they see he grew up on a farm, now it was very different. Monaghan is very different to Roscommon, believe it or not. In Ireland, even though it's such a small country, there's tremendous differences in landscape. But because he grew up on a farm, and because, I mean, he was a wonderful poet. And I feel so lucky that we read him in school, because I think that really shaped my poetic identity, even though I had no sense of writing at that point. But I think we were so lucky. And I think Patrick Kavanagh and Hopkins have quite a lot in common, in their themes, but also something about the music. Anyway, so those would be people. And then, I mean, just to say about other inspirations, you know, I mean, Elizabeth Bishop, Mary Oliver was definitely an inspiration for me. And I think she can be, you know, there's a kind of almost an intellectual snobbery, I think, about Mary Oliver. And I think she's an absolutely wonderful poet. And one of the things she taught me was observation. Look around you, go out every day and look. And, you know, we had come to live in Wicklow, my partner Isabel and I had come to live in Wicklow, um, you know, probably only about 6 years before I started to write. And so we were living in a country area. We moved from Dublin to live in the countryside. And Mary Oliver probably was I think was a huge inspiration to, you know, on my walks, to watch, to look, to take in, to pay attention. So I'd be very grateful to her. And I think she was, in how she was as a poet and how she lived her life as a poet, she was also an inspiration and continues to be. So there's some of the things about inspiration. Well, I mean, I suppose I think generosity as a poet is really important. And keeping open to learning. And I suppose I think it's that combination of trying to have a kind of a certain confidence in what you're doing and also humility, and keeping both of those, which keeps you open to learning. Um, and then I think, you know, just dedicating myself to this art. I think I am so lucky to have found this art. And so I, you know, every day, you know, giving time to this art form. So there's a, you know, there's a dedication, there's a passion, and then hopefully a generosity, and an integrity about all that goes along with writing poems, you know, with publication, with readings, you know, all of that. That's what, you know, that's what I hope for, you know. Dropping slow. Afterwards, we lie still, your breath soft across my forehead, mine hot in the shallows of your neck. Bales of hay stacked high, drying in the sun. Hens resting on their roost at the end of the day. Morning cobwebs listening on a hazel hedge. Just to say thanks very much, Benjamin, and thanks very much everybody who's watching. It's just lovely to have an audience this evening, and yeah, thanks, and thanks for a good conversation.